Imagine waking up one morning to find your life turned upside down. The land you've called home for generations, the farm where you've built your life and cared for your animals, is suddenly under threat. You've been given an ultimatum. Join a community you don't belong to or lose everything you worked for. But when you refuse to bow down to the pressure, something far worse happens. One fateful morning, you step outside, only to watch as strangers back a tow truck up to your barn, ready to take your animals, your livelihood, away from you. And as they load your beloved animals into cages, you realize something even more sinister is at play. This isn't just about rules. This is about a multi-million-dollar plan to steal your land. The question is, how far will they go to get it? And what will you do when the only thing standing between you and losing everything is your fight for justice? Stay tuned to find out how one woman's fight against corruption, greed, and betrayal unfolds. The stakes are higher than you think. And the twist? You won't see it coming. In the heart of a quiet countryside, nestled between rolling hills and wide-open fields, lies a family farm passed down through generations. For Sarah Harper, this land wasn't just soil and barns. It was her heritage, her history. This land had been her family's sanctuary, a place where her ancestors had lived, worked, and thrived for over a century. Sarah's grandfather had taught her how to ride horses in the very fields now dotted with her goats and chickens. The smell of the earth, the warmth of the barn in the winter, the sound of animals grazing in the pasture. It was all she knew. The farm had been her sanctuary, a refuge from the world. The barn, weathered with age but still standing strong, represented not just a building, but a memory, a story of perseverance, sacrifice, and love. But Sarah's farm was more than just her family's legacy. It was a symbol of independence and resilience. For as long as she could remember, the land had been a place of self-sufficiency. Growing vegetables, raising animals, and living off what the earth provided had been a way of life. It wasn't luxurious, but it was meaningful. Her father had passed the teachings of hard work and respect for the land down to her, and now it was her turn to continue the tradition. But as the years went by, the world around her began to change. The peaceful rural community that Sarah had known since childhood was transforming into something foreign. New developments sprouted up, the skyline creeping ever closer to her farm. And with this development came the whisper of an even bigger change, something that threatened to erase the very life she had worked so hard to preserve. The first signs of change came quietly. A few houses popped up along the dirt road that ran past Sarah's farm, their shiny new windows and pristine lawns standing out like a sore thumb against the natural beauty of the countryside. At first, Sarah didn't think much of it. She had always been a firm believer in live and let live, but it wasn't long before the scale of the development became undeniable. The distant hum of construction machinery began to fill the air. What had once been a peaceful haven for wildlife, open fields, and sprawling pastures was now being slowly replaced by cookie-cutter houses, paved streets, and concrete sidewalks. And with the construction came the county developers, corporate figures whose only interest in the land was how much money they could make from it. But the biggest shock came when Sarah received the official notice from the Willow Creek Estates Homeowners Association, HOA. They were demanding that Sarah either join their HOA or face serious consequences. The letter seemed harmless at first, a bureaucratic notice about community rules and guidelines. But as Sarah read it again, a sinking feeling in her stomach grew. The letter wasn't just a request, it was a warning. Sarah's property had been rezoned without her knowledge, suddenly placing her family's farm within the confines of the HOA's reach. The notice made it clear. Sarah's beloved farm, a place her family had called home for generations, was now considered part of their community. And if she didn't comply with their rules, if she didn't pay dues, follow their standards, and conform to their idea of a proper neighborhood, then her animals would be removed, and she would be forced to face heavy fines. It was a gut-wrenching blow. This was more than just a letter. This was an invasion. The worst part? Sarah hadn't even been consulted. She wasn't part of their community. She didn't want to be. Her farm, her life, was nothing like the pristine, manicured lawns and soulless homes sprouting up around her. They weren't interested in her life or her legacy. To them, Sarah's farm was just an eyesore, an inconvenient obstacle standing in the way of their perfect vision of suburban living. But Sarah wasn't one to give up easily. She had spent her life working for what she had, and she wasn't about to let some developers take it from her. The first day Sarah saw the tow truck pulling up to her farm, she thought it was a bad dream. It was a typical morning, fog hanging in the air, dew still fresh on the grass, when she heard the familiar sounds of her animals stirring in the barn. But then, something strange happened. Biscuit, her miniature pony, let out a frightened whinny. Sarah's heart raced. She rushed outside in her pajamas, half-dazed, still groggy from the night's lack of sleep. What she saw made her blood run cold. A giant tow truck with county enforcement painted on the side was backing up to her barn. The truck's massive engine roared as it neared her precious animals, her family's legacy, and her life's work. Without thinking, Sarah sprinted across the muddy yard. Her feet slipped as she tried to get closer, but nothing was going to stop her. "Stop right there," she screamed, her voice hoarse with fear and anger. She wasn't going to let them take her animals without a fight. The three people in matching navy blue polos turned around. The woman leading the group, Judith Mercer, the president of Willow Creek Estates HOA, looked at Sarah with disdain. "You must be Sarah Harper," Judith said with a smug smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Sarah's heart dropped as she realized this wasn't some kind of misunderstanding. Judith was here to take her animals. Judith's tone was cold, businesslike, as she explained that her property was now part of the Willow Creek Estates development and that all of her farm animals had to be removed immediately. Sarah's hands trembled as she tried to make sense of what was happening. The paper Judith handed her outlined a fine of $2,300 for violations, followed by the seizure of her animals. But Sarah knew this wasn't just about rules. This was about power, control, and greed. They didn't care about her family's history. They didn't care about the life she had built. They only cared about what they could take from her. The sheer audacity of it all stunned Sarah into silence for a moment. She was standing in her own yard, watching as strangers prepared to load her animals onto trucks. Her stomach churned with the realization that she was powerless to stop them. The tears that filled her eyes were not just from fear or anger. They were from the deep, heartbreaking sense of loss. This wasn't just about her animals. This was about her entire way of life being taken from her without her consent. As the days passed, the reality of what was happening began to sink in. Sarah sat in the empty barn, staring at the places where her animals had once slept. The silence was deafening. Rusty, her loyal dog, wandered around the property, his confused barking echoing in the stillness. He was just as lost as she was. It wasn't just the animals she missed. It was the life that she had known for so long. The farm had always been a place of stability, of hard work, and of family. But now, it felt like everything she had worked for was slipping through her fingers. Sarah began to dig deeper into the situation. She reached out to local officials, hoping for some clarity, but all she received were bureaucratic responses and vague assurances that everything was in order. The more she researched, the more the truth became clear. This wasn't just about animal violations or zoning. This was a deliberate effort to force her off her land, to clear the way for a luxury development that would line the pockets of the developers and leave Sarah with nothing. As Sarah pored over documents and evidence, she found herself remembering her grandfather, the man who had taught her how to care for the land and the animals, the man who had worked tirelessly to make sure that this farm could be passed down to future generations. The idea of losing it was unbearable. But it wasn't just about the farm. It was about the fight for something greater. It was about standing up to greed, corruption, and the abuse of power. Sarah knew she couldn't let them win. Not now. Not ever. Tyler Mercer, the man behind Willow Creek Estates, was introduced as a suave, well-dressed businessman with an air of confidence that oozed entitlement. To the outside world, he was the charming face of the development project, always smiling, always in control. But Sarah soon learned that behind the smile was a ruthless businessman who had no regard for anyone or anything that stood in the way of his vision. Tyler's company, Willow Creek Development LLC, had secured the rights to develop the land around Sarah's farm, and it quickly became apparent that he and his team were willing to go to any lengths to acquire her property. Sarah's farm was the last piece of land in the area that hadn't been snatched up by the developers, and it was standing in the way of their vision of a pristine, luxury neighborhood. Tyler knew that if he could force Sarah out, his development would be complete. With every call he made, every meeting he attended, Sarah felt the growing sense that this was more than just about a new development. It was about control. Tyler's manipulative tactics and his ability to manipulate local government officials made Sarah's blood boil. He was the villain in this story, the man who would stop at nothing to get what he wanted, no matter who he hurt along the way. And Sarah knew, deep down, that this fight was not just about saving her farm. It was about exposing the corruption behind it all. As Sarah sat at her kitchen table, surrounded by papers and legal notices, a call came through that she had been waiting for. A friend from her past, someone who had promised to help. Emma, a local attorney, had once been Sarah's confidant, someone who had witnessed the struggles and triumphs of her family's farm. Emma had even visited the farm as a child, running through the fields with Sarah and dreaming of a life where they could always stay in the quiet serenity of the countryside. But when Sarah heard Emma's voice on the other end of the phone, it wasn't the comforting tone she had hoped for. "Sarah," Emma said hesitantly, I don't know how to say this. You need to be careful. You're up against something bigger than you think. Tyler Mercer, he's been making moves behind the scenes, and I'm afraid I didn't tell you sooner." A wave of betrayal hit Sarah so hard she could barely breathe. She had trusted Emma, believed that the bond they shared could be counted on in times like this. But now, it felt like Emma had known about the looming threat to Sarah's land and had said nothing until it was too late. Sarah's mind raced with questions. Why didn't Emma warn her? Why hadn't she stepped in sooner to help? The emotional toll of this revelation was overwhelming. It felt like her childhood friend had turned her back on her, leaving her to face a corrupt system on her own. Yet, even through the pain, Sarah knew she had no time for regret. Her fight wasn't just for her family. It was for the future of her farm. But betrayal cut deeper than any fine or legal battle. It left an emotional scar she would never forget. The sound of Biscuit's frightened whinny was like a shot to Sarah's heart. The sun had barely begun to rise, and the familiar sights and sounds of her farm were still fresh in her mind. But that morning, something was horribly wrong. Biscuit, her miniature pony, who had been with her through thick and thin, was acting out of character. Her stomach churned with dread as she rushed outside, wearing her chicken print pajamas, barely able to shake off the sleep. What she saw stopped her in her tracks. A massive tow truck with county enforcement written in bold letters on the side was parked outside her barn, with two men already unloading cages and preparing to take her animals. Sarah's breath caught in her chest as she saw her goats being herded into cramped cages. It was happening. The nightmare she had feared was becoming real. "Stop. Stop right there," she yelled, rushing forward, nearly slipping on the muddy ground. But the workers ignored her, too focused on their task to care. She could feel the hot surge of anger rise in her chest. This was her land, her home, her life, and they were taking everything she held dear without even a second thought. The woman leading the operation, Judith Mercer, was standing by the truck with her clipboard, ticking off items on a list, as if this was just another day at the office. "You need to step aside, Sarah," Judith said coldly, her tone dripping with disdain. "We're just doing our job." But to Sarah, this wasn't just a job. This was the end of everything she had worked for. She had seen her animals grow, live, and thrive, and now they were being torn away from her. In that moment, Sarah realized that these weren't just faceless officials. These were people who were actively trying to erase her from her own home. They didn't see her farm as a family legacy. They saw it as a piece of land they could manipulate for profit. The heart-wrenching finality of the moment made Sarah realize that she would have to fight harder than ever to hold on to her legacy. The days after her animals were taken were the loneliest of Sarah's life. The barn stood empty, its walls echoing with silence, a stark contrast to the vibrant life it had once housed. Biscuit, the miniature pony she had rescued from a shelter years ago, had been a constant companion. She remembered the way he would nuzzle her neck when she fed him, his hooves softly clopping on the ground as he followed her around the property. Biscuit wasn't just a pony. He was a reminder of the love and care that Sarah had poured into her farm. But now he was gone, and so were her chickens and goats, the animals who had been her companions through every season, every hardship. The house felt so much emptier without them. Her dog, Rusty, kept wandering around the property, looking for the animals, barking in confusion as though he, too, felt the void left behind. Sarah's heart ached as she watched him, his tail drooping with sadness. It was as though everything she had fought for, the farm, her life, was slipping away. She wandered from room to room, touching the walls of the barn, running her hand along the fence where she had spent so many mornings checking on her animals. It was hard to breathe through the sorrow. There was an emptiness now that had once been filled with the sounds of clucking, baaing, and the gentle whinny of her beloved pony. The loss wasn't just physical, it was emotional. Sarah had never realized how deeply her animals had been a part of her. They weren't just livestock, they were family. Losing them felt like losing a part of herself. But as she stood there in the empty barn, a thought crept into her mind. If they could take her animals, what else would they take from her? The thought was enough to ignite a fire deep inside her. She couldn't let them get away with this. Determined to understand how her peaceful life had been turned upside down, Sarah began to research furiously. The stakes had never been higher. Her family had lived on this land for over 100 years, and now she was facing the terrifying reality that it could all be taken away from her. She contacted local officials, hoping to get some clarity about the zoning decisions that had suddenly placed her property under the control of the HOA. But every call she made only led to more confusion and frustration. The more Sarah dug, the more she uncovered a web of corruption and lies that extended far beyond her small farm. The developers, including Tyler Mercer, had quietly worked behind the scenes to change the zoning laws in their favor. The petition to rezone the area had been rushed through, with very little notice given to the public. And the worst part? The local officials, including the county commissioners, were complicit in this effort. Sarah felt a cold shiver run down her spine as she realized the truth. This wasn't just about zoning. This was a coordinated effort to seize her land for the developers' luxury housing plans. Sarah couldn't believe what she was discovering. There were so many shady deals, so many unanswered questions. She had always believed in the goodness of people. But this was something far darker. It wasn't just about property lines and legal loopholes. It was about power. And Sarah was standing in the middle of a fight she never asked for, against forces much larger than herself. But as the realization set in, a surge of determination rose within her. This wasn't just about the farm anymore. It was about exposing the truth and holding those in power accountable. She couldn't give up now. She had to find a way to stop them before it was too late. As Sarah pored over documents late into the night, the truth slowly began to piece itself together. It was more than just about her land. It was about a deliberate plan to take over the entire area for massive profit. Tyler Mercer's development company had bought up land surrounding Sarah's farm for pennies on the dollar. They had been quietly snapping up properties from elderly owners and unsuspecting families, all while building a luxury neighborhood that would become the next big thing in real estate. But Sarah's farm was the last obstacle standing in their way. Sarah dug deeper and discovered a troubling pattern. The land surrounding hers was being developed into high-end homes, and Tyler Mercer's company stood to make millions. But the true value of Sarah's property was not in the land. It was in its location. The farm sat right in the middle of the planned phase 2 of the development, where an artificial lake was to be constructed. Without her land, the whole development project would be incomplete. The lake, the crown jewel of their plans, was supposed to sit on Sarah's farm. The more Sarah uncovered, the more she realized this wasn't just a legal fight. It was a carefully orchestrated land grab, a ruthless power play designed to crush anyone who stood in their way. They were willing to do whatever it took to force Sarah out. It wasn't about HOA rules, fines, or zoning laws. It was about money. And Sarah was caught in the middle of it all. As Sarah continued her fight, the weight of the battle began to wear her down. The county was on the side of the developers, and the HOA kept issuing fines for the smallest infractions. Sarah felt like she was drowning in paperwork, legal jargon, and unhelpful officials. It was as though the entire system had turned against her. In the midst of all this, she reached out to someone she hadn't spoken to in years, her high school friend, Emma. Emma had become a successful journalist and lawyer, and Sarah remembered how they used to talk about standing up for what was right, no matter the cost. But after the betrayal, Sarah wasn't sure if Emma would even be willing to help. So, it came as a surprise when Emma agreed to meet her. The weight of their old friendship still lingered, and Sarah hoped that, despite the past, Emma would stand by her side now. They met at a local cafe, where Sarah, her hand shaking, told Emma everything. "I had no idea it had gotten this bad," Emma said softly after hearing Sarah's story. "But I can help. I know a few people who might be able to dig deeper into this." Emma wasn't just a lawyer. She had contacts in the investigative field, journalists who could shine a light on corruption. For the first time in weeks, Sarah felt a glimmer of hope. Emma had promised to dig into the shady dealings of Tyler Mercer and the HOA, and Sarah finally had someone on her side who could help expose the truth. The betrayal still hurt, but Emma's support was a lifeline. The thought of a fresh start, with someone who understood the depths of her pain, made Sarah feel like she could face whatever came next. But she knew this was just the beginning of the battle. They still had a long way to go to bring the truth to light. The days turned into weeks, and as Sarah's resolve grew stronger, so did the tension around her farm. Tyler Mercer wasn't just an opportunistic businessman. He was a relentless force who would stop at nothing to get what he wanted. Sarah had begun noticing suspicious activity around her property. Late at night, she'd hear the sounds of trucks driving slowly by her fence line. She'd catch sight of figures lingering near her barn, taking notes, snapping pictures, people who were clearly watching her every move. It was a reminder that this battle was more than just a legal fight. It was a war for control over her land, and the stakes couldn't be higher. One evening, as Sarah stood by her front porch, she saw a black SUV creeping down her long driveway. Her heart raced. She recognized it immediately. It was Tyler Mercer himself, with two men in tow, both dressed in dark suits. Sarah's stomach dropped as she realized that they weren't just making business decisions anymore. They were sizing up her property. They weren't looking for a way to coexist. They were looking for a way to take her farm from her. For the first time, Sarah felt like the walls were closing in on her. She watched from her window as Tyler and his associates paced around her property, whispering among themselves. What were they planning? What were they looking for? Sarah knew that these weren't just real estate agents or developers. They were the puppeteers of an even darker scheme. They were trying to break her spirit, trying to intimidate her into giving up her land. But Sarah wouldn't go down without a fight. It was an ordinary afternoon when Sarah's world was shaken once again. Her dog, Rusty, started barking wildly at something in the distance, and when Sarah went outside to check, her heart nearly stopped. Smoke was rising from the direction of the barn, her barn, the one place she thought was safe. As she rushed forward, she could feel the panic rising within her. She screamed for help, her voice thick with fear, but no one was around. By the time the fire trucks arrived, the damage was already done. The barn was gutted, flames licking at the sky as the firemen worked to contain the blaze. It was a miracle that none of her animals were inside, but the emotional toll of seeing her barn destroyed was overwhelming. This wasn't just a fire, it was an act of retaliation. Someone was trying to scare her out of her home, to break her physically and emotionally. Sarah stood in the yard, numb and trembling, watching as the firefighters fought the blaze. But deep down, she knew who was behind it. Tyler Mercer. He had been watching her every move, and this fire, this deliberate act of arson, was his way of sending a message. He wanted her to know that no matter how hard she fought, he would always have the upper hand. As the fire burned, Sarah's resolve hardened. This was no longer just about saving her farm. It was about standing up against the cruelty of those who thought they could push her around. The fire may have burned her barn to the ground, but it couldn't burn her spirit. Sarah knew that if she was going to win, she would have to be smarter, stronger, and more relentless than ever. The fire marked a turning point. The people who had once stood on the sidelines, hesitant to get involved, began to rally behind Sarah. It wasn't just the devastation of the fire that brought them together. It was the realization that what was happening to Sarah could happen to any one of them. Her fight had become their fight. Neighbors who had once turned a blind eye to the issues around Sarah's farm began to show up at her door, offering help in any way they could. Eleanor Jenkins, an elderly woman from the new development, was one of the first to offer her support. "What they did to you is wrong, Sarah," Eleanor said, her voice quivering with rage. "This isn't just about your farm. It's about all of us. We can't let them bulldoze our homes for their own gain." Eleanor wasn't alone. More neighbors followed, bringing food, tools, and support. A group of Sarah's neighbors organized a cleanup crew to help clear away the wreckage of the barn and repair the damage. For the first time, Sarah felt like she wasn't alone in this fight. The community that had once been divided by the developers' tactics was now united by their shared goal of standing up to corruption. They started to form an alliance, determined to fight back against the injustice that had been forced upon them. With the help of her neighbors, Sarah began to rebuild, not just her barn, but her sense of hope. This wasn't just about saving her farm anymore. It was about saving the spirit of the community, a spirit that had been threatened by greed and corruption. That as the battle dragged on, the emotional and financial toll on Sarah grew heavier. But with the support of her neighbors and the help of Emma's legal team, the tide finally began to turn. Sarah's team had uncovered crucial evidence. Proof that Tyler Mercer's company had been illegally pressuring local officials to fast-track zoning approvals for their development, bypassing public input and ignoring environmental concerns. It wasn't long before Sarah's story made the front page of a local newspaper, thanks to the investigative work of Emma's contacts. The headline read, "Corruption Uncovered. Local developer linked to illegal land grabs." The story gained traction and public outcry mounted against the developers. As more people came forward with their own stories of being harassed by the HOA, Sarah realized that this was bigger than just her. It was a movement, a community rising up against the abuse of power. Finally, in court, Sarah's legal team presented irrefutable evidence that the developers had used underhanded tactics to seize land, manipulate local authorities, and destroy families' livelihoods. The judge ruled in Sarah's favor, freezing all development actions in the area while a full investigation was conducted. Tyler Mercer and his associates were forced to pay the price for their greed, and Sarah's farm was saved. It wasn't just a personal victory. It was a victory for the community. Sarah had stood her ground, and in the process, she had brought together a group of neighbors who now stood united against injustice. The fire may have destroyed her barn, but it had ignited something far more powerful, a sense of community, of resilience, and of the importance of standing up for what is right. The feeling of being watched began to seep into every corner of Sarah's life. At first, it was the occasional sight of someone lurking on her property late at night, their shadows barely visible against the darkness. But soon it became undeniable. Someone was watching her every move. Her heart would race whenever she stepped outside, scanning the empty fields that had once been her sanctuary, now filled with a sense of unease. It wasn't just the late-night visitors that unnerved her. Sarah began to notice unfamiliar cars parked along the road near her property. They would stay for hours, unmoving, seemingly observing her every step. Every time she made a move, it felt as if the developers, and Tyler Mercer in particular, were always one step behind. The thought of it made her skin crawl. There was no place on her own land where she felt safe anymore. Her phone would ring, and she'd find herself holding her breath, half expecting it to be an anonymous threat or a warning of some new violation. Each call, each visit, each car parked too long by the fence made her more certain. This wasn't just about land. It was about control. But the fear didn't paralyze her. It fueled her. Sarah knew that they were trying to intimidate her, to break her down into submission. But Sarah had already lost so much, and there was no way she would give up the land her family had fought for. The more they watched her, the stronger she became. She would no longer hide from the danger. She would confront it head-on. The stakes had never been higher, and she wasn't about to let fear control her life. As the pressure mounted, Sarah's financial situation began to deteriorate. The mounting fines, legal fees, and cost of fighting back had drained her savings. The constant threats from the HOA, the endless demands to bring her property into compliance, were starting to feel like a heavy weight around her neck. But it wasn't just about money. It was about something far more precious, the life she had built. With every new fine, with every piece of paperwork that arrived threatening her with foreclosure, Sarah's heart broke a little more. Her land was all she had left of her family's legacy. The farm was her identity. It wasn't just about farming. It was about keeping the connection to her roots, to her ancestors, to the life that had shaped her. The thought of losing it all, of being forced out by the same people who had used her farm to sell homes for a profit, was unbearable. One evening, Sarah sat on the porch, staring at the fields that stretched before her. She could almost hear her grandfather's voice, reminding her to never give up, to always fight for what was right. But the mounting pressure made her question if she could keep fighting. The emotional strain, coupled with the financial burden, had begun to take its toll. The fight for her farm wasn't just a legal battle anymore. It was becoming a fight for her very sense of self. But as the sun set behind the fields, Sarah felt a flicker of resolve. This was her fight, and she wasn't going to let the darkness take it from her. She would stand firm, even if it meant losing everything. Just when things seemed darkest, a spark of hope appeared in the form of an unexpected ally. One day, as Sarah was researching legal documents in the local library, she ran into an old neighbor, John Harper, a retired accountant who had lived down the road for years. John had always been a quiet man, content to stay out of the limelight, but Sarah knew he had a sharp mind and an eye for detail. John had been following the developments in the area, and as soon as he heard about the struggle Sarah was facing, he offered to help. "I may not have much to offer, Sarah," he said, "but I've seen what these developers are doing, and I think I can help you fight them. I've been doing some research into the zoning laws and the land acquisitions they've been making. There's something off about the way they've been handling things." It was like a weight had been lifted off Sarah's shoulders. For the first time in weeks, she felt like she wasn't alone in this fight. John's research uncovered several inconsistencies in the way the developers had obtained their zoning permits. The county officials had been pressured into approving the development plan without following the proper procedures. John's work not only confirmed Sarah's suspicions, but also opened a new avenue for legal action. Together, Sarah, Emma, and John began to piece together the evidence they needed. Sarah's newfound sense of hope gave her the strength to press on. She realized that even in the darkest of times, help could come from the most unexpected places. With John's expertise and Emma's connections, Sarah knew they had a fighting chance. The momentum continued to build as Sarah and her allies began to connect the dots between the developers, the corrupt county officials, and the HOA. Every legal document, every zoning application, every meeting held in secrecy, the pieces began to fit together like a jigsaw puzzle. What Sarah had once thought was an isolated battle for her farm now seemed like a much bigger story, one of greed, manipulation, and corruption at the highest levels. Emma, who had once been unsure of how deep the corruption went, now found herself deeply invested in the case. She knew that exposing this conspiracy could not only save Sarah's farm, but also prevent other families from suffering the same fate. The local media took notice, and a journalist from a nearby investigative newspaper reached out to Sarah for a story. "This is bigger than just your farm, Sarah," the journalist said. "We're talking about systematic corruption that's affecting people across the entire county." As the story began to spread, the pressure on the developers and the local officials intensified. More people came forward, sharing their experiences with the corrupt practices of the developers. The walls of silence began to crumble as more whistleblowers came out of the shadows. It was clear now, this wasn't just a fight for one woman's farm. It was a battle for justice for everyone who had been wronged. But with the growing public scrutiny came retaliation. Sarah began receiving anonymous threats. Her phone rang with calls from blocked numbers, each one a reminder of the dangerous path she was walking. But she refused to back down. As the public attention grew, so did her determination. She was no longer fighting alone. The personal sacrifices Sarah made during this fight were immense. With each passing day, her emotional strength was tested. Her savings had been drained to pay for legal fees, and the mounting fines seemed endless. She had to sell off precious family heirlooms, things that her grandparents had cherished, to cover the cost of fighting back. The farmhouse, which had always been a place of warmth and love, now felt cold and empty. Her family, who had supported her in every way they could, watched as Sarah sacrificed everything to save the land. There were moments when Sarah questioned if she was doing the right thing. Could she continue to risk everything for something that seemed so out of reach? There were nights when she would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering how much longer she could keep up the fight. But despite the sacrifices, Sarah remained focused. It wasn't just about the money or the farm. It was about something far more important. It was about her integrity, her connection to the land, and her commitment to preserving the life her family had worked so hard to build. The fight for her farm became a fight for something greater, a symbol of the resilience and determination that runs through her veins. And as she sacrificed more, Sarah felt the support of her community grow stronger. Neighbors who had once remained silent now offered their assistance. It was as if her sacrifices were galvanizing the entire town to rise up against the forces that threatened them. Every sacrifice, every moment of doubt, led Sarah closer to the day when she could finally reclaim what was rightfully hers. After weeks of research and sleepless nights, Sarah's fight for justice finally began to bear fruit. The evidence that John had uncovered had already turned the tide in her favor, and Emma's legal expertise was beginning to chip away at the developer's stronghold. But the true spark of hope came when Sarah received an unexpected phone call from a local reporter who had been following the investigation closely. Margot Rivera, an investigative journalist known for her no-nonsense approach to corruption, had been tipped off about the shady dealings of Willow Creek Development and the corrupt county officials who had enabled the land grab. "Sarah," Margot said in a low voice, "I've been digging deeper, and I found proof that the developers and some key officials have been lying to the public. They've been fast-tracking zoning changes and ignoring environmental concerns to line their pockets. I think it's time to go public with this." This news was a lifeline, a beacon of hope in a sea of frustration. The fact that someone from the media was willing to expose the truth gave Sarah renewed strength. The public had a right to know what was happening behind the scenes, and now they would. With Margot's help, Sarah's case was about to hit the front page, exposing the corruption that had plagued her community. For the first time in months, Sarah felt a sense of justice rising. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for the future of her town, her neighbors, and the generations that would come after. Margot's story was going to change everything. The moment Sarah had been waiting for finally arrived. The story, Corruption Uncovered, Developers and Local Officials Exposed in Land Grab Scheme, hit the front page of a local newspaper. It was the kind of story that shook people to their core. People who had lived in the area for decades, who had seen the slow creep of development, could finally see the truth. The developers had been using dirty tactics, manipulating the system to gain control of land that wasn't theirs to take. The community was outraged. What had once seemed like a quiet, rural area was now a battleground for greed, power, and corruption. And Sarah was leading the charge. With the media spotlight on her, the pressure on the developers and the local officials grew unbearable. For the first time, the powers that had been manipulating the system were on the defensive. They couldn't ignore the growing public outrage. The legal battles were far from over, but this first major victory was a turning point. The injunction had temporarily frozen all development in the area, buying Sarah the time she needed to gather more evidence and rally her community. For the first time in a long while, Sarah dared to believe that she could win this fight. The battle was far from over, but this victory had shifted the balance. She wasn't alone anymore. She had the power of truth on her side. Just as Sarah began to feel a glimmer of hope, the developers retaliated in the most malicious way possible. One night, as Sarah sat in her living room, her dog Rusty began barking furiously at something outside. Sarah rushed to the window, heart pounding in her chest. She could see the flicker of orange light in the distance, a glow against the night sky. Smoke began to billow up from the direction of her barn. A wave of panic crashed over Sarah as she rushed outside, praying that her animals weren't inside. Her heart sank as she saw the flames licking at the barn's roof, the heat from the fire radiating outward. This wasn't an accident. It was an act of retaliation. Someone had set her barn on fire, hoping to destroy everything she had worked for. By the time the fire trucks arrived, it was clear that the barn was beyond saving. Sarah could only watch helplessly as the flames consumed everything, the place where her animals had lived, where her family's memories had been made. She could feel her resolve slipping, the weight of loss pressing down on her chest. But then, something incredible happened. Neighbors, people who had once stayed silent, came rushing to her side. They grabbed garden hoses, buckets, and whatever they could find to help douse the flames. It was an overwhelming display of community support that Sarah had never expected. It wasn't just her farm at stake anymore. It was their home, their sense of belonging, and their shared history. Together, they managed to save her animals, leading them to safety as the fire raged on. The developers had hoped the fire would break Sarah's spirit, but all it did was strengthen her resolve. This act of retaliation was a wake-up call, and Sarah knew that the fight was far from over. But as the flames died down, she looked at her neighbors, now gathered around her, and realized that together they could withstand anything. In the wake of the fire, the community began to rally around Sarah in a way she had never imagined. Neighbors who had once kept their distance, too afraid to speak up, now showed up in droves to help. They brought tools, food, and moral support, offering whatever they could to help Sarah rebuild what had been destroyed. It was clear that Sarah's fight had become something much bigger. It was about protecting the values of community, legacy, and justice. Sarah wasn't just fighting for her farm anymore. She was fighting for her neighbors, for the values they all held dear. It wasn't just about the land. It was about a way of life. Together, the community organized a series of meetings to discuss the corruption they had uncovered and how they could stop the developers from taking over their town. The more Sarah's neighbors learned about the deceitful tactics of the developers, the more determined they became to stand up for what was right. They formed a grassroots movement, collecting signatures, raising awareness, and pushing for greater transparency in local government. They demanded that the county reverse the zoning changes that had allowed the developers to take control in the first place. The developers had underestimated the power of a united community. They thought they could scare Sarah into submission, but instead, they had ignited a fire in the hearts of the entire town. And now, the fight had become something much bigger than Sarah. This was a battle for the soul of their community, and everyone was ready to stand and fight. The day Sarah had been waiting for finally arrived. After months of battling the developers, the corruption within the county government was exposed for all to see. The legal team, bolstered by the evidence gathered by Sarah, Emma, John, and the investigative journalists, had built a strong case. The truth had come to light, and it couldn't be ignored anymore. In a dramatic court session, the judge ruled in Sarah's favor, freezing all development in the area indefinitely. The zoning changes that had allowed the developers to target Sarah's land were reversed, and the corrupt county officials involved in the scheme were removed from their positions. Tyler Mercer and his associates were held accountable for their actions, with several of them facing criminal charges for fraud, bribery, and conspiracy. The moment the judge's gavel came down, Sarah felt a weight lift off her shoulders. She had won. The farm that her family had worked for generations to build was saved. But it wasn't just about the victory. It was about what had been built along the way. The community that had come together to fight back, the bonds of solidarity that had been forged in the heat of battle, were more important than anything else. Sarah's farm became a symbol of resilience, of standing up for what is right, even when the odds seem impossible. The barn, rebuilt by her neighbors, now stood as a reminder of what could be accomplished when people came together for a common cause. The animals returned to their peaceful home, and Sarah, surrounded by friends and family, knew that her fight had changed everything. The fight was over, but the lessons would last a lifetime. Standing up for justice, preserving what is rightfully yours, and coming together as a community. These were the lessons that Sarah and her neighbors had learned, and they would never forget them. And as Sarah sat on her porch, watching the sun set over her land, she knew one thing for certain. No matter what the future held, she would never let go of the legacy she had fought so hard to protect.